I have ever kept in my entire life. So when he showed up to my 77th birthday dinner last night, wearing a $3,000 tailored suit and carrying a heavy mahogany presentation box, I was immediately suspicious. My daughter-in-law Stephanie was clinging to his arm. She was flashing me that fake, practiced smile she always reserves for the country club elite. She has always viewed me as nothing more than an open wallet. She handed me the heavy wooden box. "Happy birthday, Harrison," she had said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Bradley picked this out especially for you. It is incredibly rare." I unlatched the brass hinges and opened the box. Resting on a bed of crushed red velvet was a limited edition bottle of imported Russian vodka. The glass was frosted, and the label was embossed in thick gold lettering. It was an absolute insult wrapped in expensive packaging. I remember looking up at my son, searching his eyes for some kind of twisted joke or a sign of ignorance, but Bradley just smiled, clapping me on the shoulder. "Only the best for you, Dad," he had said smoothly. I did not make a scene. I am an old wolf of the business world, and you do not survive in the construction industry by showing your enemies your hand. I simply thanked them, politely closed the box, and set it on the living room mantel. But my mind was racing. Why would my son, the boy I raised and gave everything to, give a recovering alcoholic a bottle of premium vodka? It was not just thoughtless. It felt deliberate. It felt like a sick test. Or worse, it felt like a trap. And now this morning, the sheer panic in his voice over the phone confirmed my absolute darkest suspicions. "Dad, please tell me you are joking." Bradley pleaded through the phone, his voice cracking like a frightened child. He sounded like a cornered animal. "Tell me Mitchell does not have the bottle. Mitchell Reed is my attorney. He is a 60-year-old bulldog in a suit, a man who has been my best friend and legal counsel for over 3 decades. Mitchell is the kind of lawyer who reads the fine print of the fine print. He is ruthless, and he protects my interests like a guard dog. If there was a trap hidden in that gift, Mitchell would find it." "I am not joking, Bradley," I said, keeping my tone perfectly level and completely devoid of emotion. "Mitchell stopped by early this morning on his way to the airport. He is flying to London to handle a corporate merger for me. I thought he would appreciate the gift much more than a sober man ever could. He took the mahogany box with him." That was a lie, of course. Mitchell was not going to London. He was probably still asleep in his townhouse across town. But I needed to see exactly how Bradley would react. I needed to measure the depth of his panic. "You gave it to Mitchell?" Bradley gasped. I could hear the sound of his dress shoes pacing frantically on the hardwood floors of his upscale home. "Dad, listen to me very carefully. You have to call him. You have to call him right now and tell him not to open that box." "Why?" I asked, feigning innocent confusion. "It is just a bottle of vodka, son." "It is not just vodka," Bradley shouted, losing whatever shred of composure he had left. "It is a $15,000 corporate gift. It was meant for the chief executive officer of our biggest client." I grabbed the wrong box from my office. "Dad, if Mitchell drinks that or if he loses it, I am completely ruined. The board of directors will fire me. They will sue me for corporate theft. You have to get it back." I listened to the desperate pleading in his voice. It was a good lie. A very plausible lie designed to make me feel sorry for him. But it was still a lie. I know the inventory and the budget of my own company. I built it. We do not buy $15,000 bottles of liquor for our clients. We buy them prime rib dinners and golf club memberships. My son was lying straight to my face. "I will see what I can do," I said quietly. "I am coming over right now," Bradley declared. "Do not do anything until I get there." He hung up the phone before I could respond. I lowered the receiver and looked out at the rolling green hills of my property. The morning air was crisp and cold, but I felt a completely different kind of chill settling deep into my aging bones. My son was terrified. And he was not terrified of losing his job. He was terrified of what my lawyer might find. I walked back into my living room and looked at the heavy mahogany box. It was still sitting exactly where I had left it on the mantel last night. I had not given it to Mitchell. Not yet. Something was very, very wrong in my family. And as I stared at that frosted glass bottle, I made a silent promise to myself. I was going to find out exactly what my son was hiding, no matter how much the truth might hurt. It did not take long for him to arrive. Exactly 20 minutes after I hung up the phone, the aggressive roar of a German engine shattered the quiet morning peace of my ranch. I stood perfectly still by the front window, holding my warm coffee cup, and watched Bradley violently halt his black car on the gravel driveway. He parked at a terrible angle, one tire tearing deeply into the manicured grass of the front lawn I had spent hours tending just last weekend. He threw the car door open and practically leaped out into the cold air. He was not wearing his usual expensive tailored suit today. Instead, he had thrown on a wrinkled polo shirt and baggy sweatpants. That detail alone told me absolutely everything I needed to know about his current state of mind. My son is a man who meticulously irons his socks. For him to leave his house looking like he just rolled out of bed meant he was running on pure panic. I opened the heavy wooden front door before he could even knock. He almost fell over the threshold, his chest heaving violently as he gasped for air. Drops of cold sweat clung to his pale forehead, shining brightly in the soft morning light. His eyes darted wildly past me, scanning the hallway, looking desperately toward the living room mantel where the heavy wooden box had been resting the night before. "Dad," he panted, gripping the doorframe with white knuckles to steady his trembling body. "Where is it? Where is the box?" I took a deliberate step back, giving him room to enter, but keeping my posture rigid and completely unyielding. "Calm down, Bradley," I said, keeping my voice low and remarkably steady. "You look like you're about to have a heart attack right here in my foyer." He stepped inside, his hands visibly shaking as he ran his fingers through his uncombed hair. "I cannot calm down," he fired back, his voice pitching up a full octave in sheer desperation. "I just told you on the phone earlier. This is a massive disaster. You have to understand what is truly at stake here today." I led him into the spacious living room, gesturing calmly for him to sit down on the sofa. He completely ignored the comfortable leather armchair and began pacing rapidly back and forth across the vintage Persian rug. "Listen to me very carefully, Dad," he began, his eyes wide and pleading, as he launched into his heavily rehearsed explanation. "That bottle was not meant for you. I know I said it was a birthday gift yesterday, but I was covering up a massive professional screw-up. That vodka is a $15,000 corporate asset. It was a custom order specifically meant for the chief executive officer of our biggest international client. They are flying in from Dubai this very afternoon. I was supposed to bring it to the executive board meeting today to present it to him personally. But I was so incredibly rushed yesterday, and the packaging boxes look exactly the same. I grabbed the wrong one from the secure corporate vault. If I do not walk into that high-stakes meeting with that exact bottle today, the board of directors will fire me on the spot. They will sue me for gross negligence and blatant embezzlement. My entire career will be over by sunset if you do not help me right now." I stood there silently and listened to him weave this intricate tapestry of deceit. It was a truly masterful performance. If I were any other father, I might have felt a sudden surge of terrifying panic for my boy. I might have rushed straight to the telephone, dialed my lawyer frantically, and begged him to return the precious cargo to save my son from utter professional ruin. But I am not just any average father. I am a tough man who spent 4 decades dealing with corrupt contractors, lying material suppliers, and cutthroat real estate developers. I know exactly what a desperate liar looks like when their back is pressed firmly against the wall. Bradley was sweating entirely too much for a simple corporate mistake. He was breathing much too shallowly. His eyes stubbornly refused to meet mine for more than a brief fraction of a second, constantly darting back to the empty spot on the stone mantel. A $15,000 bottle of imported liquor is a serious financial matter, yes. But it is certainly not a matter that makes a confident regional director look like he is about to face a brutal firing squad. There was clearly something hidden inside that box that went far beyond strict corporate policy or a botched client presentation. He was hiding something fatal. I let a heavy, suffocating silence fill the large room, forcing him to stew painfully in his own rising anxiety. Finally, I looked him dead in the eyes and delivered the crushing blow. "I am so sorry, son," I said, keeping my weathered face completely blank and unreadable. "But it is simply too late." Bradley stopped his frantic pacing instantly. He froze right in the middle of the expensive rug. "What do you mean it is too late?" he whispered softly, the remaining color rapidly draining from his face until he looked exactly like a ghost. I sighed deeply, crossing my arms tightly over my chest to maintain my imposing posture. "I told you clearly on the phone." Mitchell took the box with him. He was heading straight to the private airstrip. His flight to London took off 10 minutes ago. He is going to be in Europe for the entire week negotiating the new supply contracts. He will not return until next Tuesday. I watched the remaining strength completely vanish from my son. His knees buckled. He physically collapsed onto the leather sofa, dropping like a heavy stone. He buried his face in his trembling hands, surrendering to utter hopeless despair. Eventually, the heavy silence became too much for him to bear. He lifted his face from his hands, looking at me with bloodshot eyes. When he realized I was not going to magically produce the bottle, he stood up on shaky legs and stumbled blindly toward the front door. I followed him out, watching from the porch as he crawled back into his expensive car. He reversed out of the driveway, throwing loose gravel into the air, and sped off down the road. As soon as his taillights disappeared, my calm facade vanished. I hurried back into the living room, my heart pounding heavily against my ribs. I walked straight to the mantel and grabbed the mahogany presentation box. It felt surprisingly heavy. I carried it out the back door and climbed into my old pickup truck. I turned the key, the engine roaring to life, and drove out of the ranch gates, heading straight toward the city limits. The early morning traffic was just beginning to pick up, but I barely noticed the other cars. My mind was entirely consumed by the image of my son sweating and trembling in my foyer. I needed answers from the only man in this world I truly trusted. 25 minutes later, I pulled into the quiet, gated community where Mitchell Reed lived. I parked my truck aggressively in his pristine driveway, grabbed the wooden box from the passenger seat, and marched right up to his front porch. I pressed the doorbell and held my thumb against the button until I heard the lock click. Mitchell opened the door wearing a dark blue silk bathrobe, his reading glasses perched near the end of his nose and a steaming mug of black coffee in his left hand. He looked at me, then looked down at the large box tucked tightly under my arm. He did not ask any useless questions. He simply stepped aside and motioned for me to come inside. I walked past him and headed straight for the large marble island in the center of his modern kitchen. I set the box down with a loud thud. Mitchell closed the front door, walked over to the kitchen counter, and set his coffee mug down. "What is going on, Harrison?" he asked, his sharp eyes studying my tense expression. "You look like you are getting ready to go to war." "I just might be," I replied, my voice raspy. I quickly recounted the entire morning. I told him about the birthday dinner, the inappropriate gift, the panicked phone call at dawn, and the pathetic sweat-drenched visit from my son. I told him about the elaborate lie Bradley had spun regarding the corporate client and the $15,000 price tag. Mitchell listened in absolute silence. His face gave nothing away. When I finished, he reached out and slowly unlatched the brass hinges of the box. He opened the lid, revealing the frosted glass bottle resting on the crushed red velvet. "A corporate gift for a client from Dubai," Mitchell mused softly, his tone dripping with thick skepticism. That is a very interesting choice of story, especially considering that your son knows I handle all the high-level corporate conflict resolutions for your firm. Exactly, I said, leaning over the counter. He is terrified of this box, Mitchell. He practically begged me to get it back before you could look at it. Mitchell reached into the box and carefully lifted the heavy bottle of vodka out of its velvet cradle. He held it up to the kitchen lights, inspecting the seals and the liquid inside. The bottle itself appears perfectly normal, he noted, setting it gently on the marble counter next to his coffee. He then picked up the empty mahogany box. He turned it over in his hands, examining the smooth wood grain, the brass fittings, and the overall construction. He frowned, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose. He weighed the empty box in his palms, moving it up and down slightly. "Harrison," he said, his voice dropping to a serious analytical register. "Look at the depth of this box. Then look at the bottle." I stepped closer, comparing the two. The interior compartment lined with velvet seemed significantly shallower than the actual exterior height of the wooden case. "It is too thick at the bottom," Mitchell stated factually. He set the box down and tapped the inside of the velvet base with his knuckles. The sound that echoed back was not the solid, dull thud of thick wood. It was a sharp, distinct, hollow click. "There is a false bottom," I whispered, a cold knot forming tightly in my stomach. Mitchell did not say a word. He turned around, walked over to a heavy utility drawer near his pantry, and pulled out a steel claw hammer. He walked back to the kitchen island, his expression completely grim. He positioned the claw end of the hammer firmly against the inner edge of the wooden lining. With one swift, forceful downward pull, he pried the velvet-covered panel upward. The thin wood cracked loudly, splintering apart. Mitchell tossed the broken pieces of wood and velvet onto the counter, exposing a small, perfectly carved rectangular compartment hidden deep within the thick mahogany base. We both leaned in to look at what my son had been so desperately trying to hide. Resting in the center of the hidden compartment was a tiny black micro SD card. But that was not what made the blood freeze in my veins. Lying right next to the memory card, secured perfectly in a custom-cut groove in the wood, was a small glass vial. It was completely unlabeled, sealed tightly with a rubber stopper, and filled to the brim with a perfectly clear, unknown liquid. Mitchell stared at the vial, his jaw tightening. "This is not corporate espionage, Harrison," he said quietly. "This is something much, much worse than either of us could have imagined." Mitchell did not waste another second. He left the broken mahogany pieces scattered across his pristine marble island and gestured for me to follow him down the wide hallway. We walked into his home office, a room lined with heavy leather-bound law books and thick oak paneling. He sat down behind his massive desk and unlocked the bottom drawer, pulling out a thick, matte black laptop. This was not his usual work computer. This was his secure, encrypted machine, the one he only used when dealing with highly sensitive corporate litigation. He booted it up, his fingers flying across the keyboard to type in a long string of passwords. Once the home screen appeared, he took the tiny black micro-memory card and slid it carefully into the side port. The computer hummed quietly. A small loading bar appeared on the screen, scanning the drive for malicious software before allowing access. I stood right behind his leather chair, my hands resting heavily on the high backrest, staring intently at the glowing monitor. My breathing felt shallow. The vial of clear liquid was securely tucked into my breast pocket, but the digital secrets held on this tiny piece of plastic terrified me even more. The loading bar vanished, replaced by a simple folder icon named with a random string of numbers. Mitchell double-clicked it. Dozens of spreadsheet files and PDF documents flooded the screen. They were meticulously organized by year and quarter. Mitchell opened the master ledger file. Rows and rows of complex financial data filled the monitor. To an untrained eye, it would look like standard corporate accounting. But Mitchell and I have spent our entire lives reading these exact types of spreadsheets. It only took him a few seconds of scrolling to spot the glaring anomalies. He leaned closer to the screen, his eyes narrowing to sharp slits. "These are offshore wire transfers," he muttered, his voice tight with rising anger. "But they are being routed through a domestic holding group first." He clicked on a folder labeled Legal Formation Documents. 4 separate certificates of incorporation popped up. They were 4 distinct shell companies, all officially registered in the state of Delaware. The entities had generic meaningless names like Apex Logistics Solutions and Horizon Material Management. On paper, they looked like standard third-party vendors that our construction supply company would regularly hire for logistics and transport. But when Mitchell opened the associated banking information and the authorized signatory pages, the truth hit me like a physical punch to the gut. The sole managing directors and primary account holders for all 4 of these phantom companies were my son Bradley Caldwell and my daughter-in-law Stephanie. They had established an entirely fake corporate infrastructure right under my nose. Mitchell began cross-referencing the outgoing payments from my actual company with the incoming deposits to their Delaware accounts. The scale of the theft was absolutely breathtaking. Every single month for the past 3 years, Bradley had been authorizing massive payments to these 4 shell companies for phantom shipments of steel and concrete that never actually existed. He was using his authority as the regional director to bypass the standard auditing protocols. Mitchell highlighted a column at the bottom of the master spreadsheet and ran a quick calculation. The total sum flashed on the screen: $8 million. My own son and his greedy wife had systematically siphoned $8 million out of my life's work. But the true horror of their crime had not even fully registered yet. Mitchell kept digging, tracing exactly which internal corporate accounts Bradley was draining to fund these fake invoices. Suddenly, Mitchell stopped typing. His hands hovered frozen over the keyboard. He looked up at me, his face pale and his expression filled with a profound, sickening sorrow. "Harrison," he whispered softly, "he is not stealing from the general operating budget. He is not taking from the executive profit margins. He is pulling these funds directly through the employee benefits portal. He is draining the workers' pension fund." The air completely left my lungs. I stumbled backward, my legs suddenly too weak to support my weight, and collapsed heavily into the leather guest chair across from the desk. The pension fund. That was not just company money. That was the blood, sweat, and future security of the men and women who had built my empire with their bare hands. I closed my eyes, and a flood of faces rushed into my mind. I saw old Marcus, the foreman, who had worked 12-hour shifts in the blistering Texas heat, with 2 blown-out knees just to make sure our foundations were poured perfectly. I saw David, the crane operator, who had missed his own daughter's graduation because we had a critical safety delay on a high-rise project. I remembered sitting with these men in the dirt, eating cold sandwiches out of tin lunchboxes, promising them that if they gave me their youth and their strength, I would make absolutely certain they never had to worry about their twilight years. I had created that specific retirement fund to protect them. It was my sacred oath to the blue-collar workers who were the true backbone of my success. And my son, a boy who had never lifted a shovel or swung a hammer in his entire privileged life, a boy whose expensive college tuition was paid for by the sweat of those exact same workers, was stealing their future so his wife could wear designer dresses and he could play the big shot at the country club. The crushing weight of the betrayal was agonizing. It was not just a crime against me. It was a vicious, unforgivable crime against innocent, hard-working families. I opened my eyes and looked at the glowing numbers on the screen. The initial shock was fading rapidly, being replaced by a cold, dark, and terrifyingly calm rage. I was going to make them pay for every penny. I grabbed my phone and dialed the police. I wanted him in handcuffs immediately. I wanted to watch them throw him into a squad car. Before I pressed call, Mitchell grabbed my wrist. He forced me to lower the phone. "Do not do it, Harrison," he commanded. "If you call the police right now, we will lose everything." I stared at him, chest heaving. "He is stealing from my men," I growled. "He is robbing the people who trusted me. He needs to be locked in a cage." Mitchell nodded slowly, but did not release my wrist. "I know," he said calmly, "and he will be. But you must look at the bigger picture. These Delaware shell companies are temporary holding accounts. If Bradley suspects we know, he will wire those $8 million offshore instantly. If the police show up, he will panic and flush the money away. We have to secure the stolen funds first. We have to trap him financially before we trap him legally." I closed my eyes and exhaled. Mitchell was absolutely right. He was always right. My brain knew a silent war was the only way to protect my workers. I placed my phone down. "So what do we do?" I asked. Mitchell leaned back. "We buy time," he explained smoothly. "We make your son believe his lie worked. We make him think you are a gullible old man. Call him. Tell him the problem is solved." Speaking to Bradley again made my stomach churn. I had to comfort the man destroying my life. But I am a businessman. I have shaken hands with enemies before. I picked up my phone, took a deep breath, and dialed his number. I put it on speaker. It rang twice before Bradley answered. His voice was tight with panic. "Hello, Dad," he answered quickly. "Did you talk to Mitchell? Is he coming back?" I forced my voice to relax, injecting mild amusement. "Bradley, you can stop worrying," I said smoothly. "I just got off the phone with Mitchell. He was calling from the departure lounge at the airport. It turns out he did not even make it onto the plane with the box." Bradley sucked in a sharp, audible breath. "What happened?" he asked, his voice trembling on the edge of a total breakdown. "Well, it seems Mitchell is not quite as smart as we pay him to be." I chuckled softly. "He tried to take that heavy wooden box through the standard carry-on security checkpoint. The Transportation Security Administration agents flagged it immediately. They told him he could not bring a large unmarked glass bottle of liquid onto the airplane. He tried to argue with them, but you know how airport security is these days. They confiscated the entire box and threw it straight into the contraband disposal bin. Mitchell is furious, but the bottle is completely gone. Destroyed." The silence on the other end of the line was incredibly profound. I could practically hear the gears turning in Bradley's head as he processed the magnitude of this fabricated news. Then a massive, heavy exhalation of breath blasted through the phone speaker. It was the unmistakable sound of a desperate man escaping a literal death sentence. "Oh, thank God," Bradley breathed out, his voice suddenly weak and completely drained of tension. "Dad, you have no idea. That is incredible news. I mean, it is terrible that the gift is gone, but I can write off the loss with corporate accounting. I can tell the client it was damaged in transit. You just saved my entire career, Dad." "I am just glad everything worked out for you, son," I replied, my tone perfectly even. "You sounded so stressed this morning. I would hate for a silly corporate mistake to ruin your big day. We can just forget this whole ugly mess ever happened." "Yes, absolutely," Bradley quickly agreed, the false confidence rapidly returning to his voice. "Thank you, Dad. I owe you one. I really do. I have to go prepare for the meeting now, but I will come see you this weekend. We will have a nice dinner to celebrate." Before I could say goodbye, there was a brief shuffling sound on his end of the call, like he had lowered the phone from his ear, but had not yet pressed the end button. In that split second of careless vulnerability, the sensitive microphone picked up a faint, whispered conversation in the background. It was my daughter-in-law, Stephanie. Her voice was sharp and laced with thick, arrogant condescension. "See," I heard her whisper distinctly. "I told you the clueless old man would buy it. We are perfectly safe." The line clicked and went completely dead. I sat frozen in the guest chair, staring at the blank screen of my cell phone. The clueless old man, she had called me. Those venomous words echoed loudly in the quiet space of Mitchell's home office. The final lingering threads of paternal affection I held for my son snapped entirely in that exact moment. They thought I was just a fragile, gullible fool. They thought they had successfully manipulated me, robbed me blind, and secured their luxurious future at my expense. They genuinely believed that they had won the game. I slowly looked up at Mitchell. He was already typing rapidly on his encrypted laptop, preparing the legal documents we would need for the coming slaughter. He did not even need to say a word. He knew exactly what had just happened to my soul. The shock and the heartbreak were completely gone, now evaporated like water on a hot skillet. In their place was a freezing wasteland of absolute resolve. My son and his greedy wife had chosen to treat my love as a weakness. They had chosen to steal from the men who built their unearned privilege. The shadow play had officially begun, and I was going to teach them a lesson in absolute ruin. I left Mitchell's house with a singular, unbreakable focus. The drive back to my ranch felt different this time. The landscape passing by my window was no longer just the beautiful Texas countryside. It was the terrain of a battlefield. As soon as I pulled through my front gates, I made a phone call. I did not call the local police department or any standard private investigator you might find in the yellow pages. I called a ghost-tier security firm based out of Dallas. These were former intelligence operatives, men who specialized in corporate espionage, asset extraction, and deep surveillance. They were not cheap, but I had millions of dollars that my son had not yet managed to steal. I told the coordinator exactly what I needed. He asked no personal questions, only logistical ones. Within 10 minutes, the entire operation was fully planned and paid for. Next, I had to lay the groundwork for my cover story. I picked up my cell phone and sent a casual text message to Bradley. I told him that the stress of the morning had really worn me out. I said I was going to drive down to the Gulf Coast for a quiet, isolated weekend fishing trip to clear my head. I explicitly told him that cellular reception would be terrible out on the water, so I would be unreachable for the next 2 days. He replied almost instantly, "Have a great time, Dad. You deserve it. Rest up." I scoffed at the screen. He was probably already planning how to spend his next stolen paycheck. Early the next morning, a plain white utility van pulled into my long gravel driveway. There were no company logos on the side, no identifying markers of any kind. 3 men stepped out. They wore unremarkable gray coveralls and carried heavy reinforced black Pelican cases. They did not look like standard alarm technicians. They moved with a terrifying, silent efficiency. When I opened the front door, the lead technician simply nodded at me. He did not offer a handshake or small talk. He just asked for the architectural blueprints of the property, which I had already laid out on the kitchen island. I watched as they methodically unpacked their equipment. These were not the bulky security cameras you see mounted on the ceilings of grocery stores. These were micro-lenses, tiny fiber optic wires, and highly sensitive audio bugs designed to be entirely invisible to the naked eye. They divided the house into zones and went straight to work. I stood in the doorway of the living room, a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands, and watched them begin to dismantle my personal sanctuary. The lead technician pulled out a specialized drill with a microscopic bit. He approached the heavy stone mantel above the fireplace. The exact same mantel where that cursed mahogany box had rested just yesterday. As the high-pitched whine of the drill cut through the quiet air, a profound wave of sorrow washed over me. I looked around the large, sunlit room. Martha and I had built this house together from the ground up. We had spent countless evenings poring over design catalogs, arguing playfully about the color of the hardwood floors and the style of the crown molding. This house was meant to be our forever home. It was the place where we celebrated holidays, where we hosted family dinners, where we had dreamed of watching our grandchildren grow up. Every single nail, every wooden beam, every piece of carefully chosen furniture held a precious memory of the woman I loved. Now, strange men in gray suits were drilling holes into the drywall, slipping tiny electronic eyes behind the electrical outlets, and hiding highly sensitive microphones inside the intricate bases of the table lamps. They moved into the dining room, embedding a microscopic camera directly into the crystal chandelier that hung above the grand oak table. They infiltrated my home office, planting audio recorders inside the bindings of my reference books and a camera behind the ventilation grate. They were turning the home I built with the love of my life into a cold, clinical war zone. The sacred private spaces where I had mourned my wife and fought for my sobriety were being transformed into a sophisticated digital trap. It felt like a terrible violation, a desecration of Martha's memory. But I knew it was absolutely necessary. My home had already been violated the moment my son and his greedy wife decided to use it as a staging ground for their vile theft. By late afternoon, the white van was packed up and ready to leave. The house looked exactly as it had before they arrived. Not a single speck of drywall dust remained on the floor. Not a single wire was visible. The lead technician handed me a sleek encrypted tablet computer. He tapped the screen, and instantly a grid of high-definition video feeds appeared. I could see my living room from 3 different angles. I could see the dining room table in perfect clarity. I could read the titles of the books on my office desk through the ventilation camera. He tapped another button, and the ambient sound of the house flooded through the tablet's speakers. The audio was incredibly crisp. I could hear the faint humming of the kitchen refrigerator all the way from the office feed. "The system is live, Mr. Caldwell," the technician said, in a low, flat voice. "It runs on an independent cellular network. If they cut the power or disable the router, it will not matter. The battery backups will record continuously for 72 hours, and everything uploads to a secure cloud server in real time. Nobody can delete the footage." I thanked him, and they drove away without another word. I was left entirely alone in my quiet, empty house. I sat down in my leather armchair and stared at the glowing tablet waiting for them. The house was dead quiet. I watched the camera feeds tracing the invisible lines of my trap. My mind was on the small glass vial I handed to an old friend that morning. Dr. Victor Hughes is a retired toxicologist who owes me a large favor. I had driven to his laboratory, handed him the unlabeled vial, and asked him to run a chemical breakdown. I told him to keep the inquiry strictly off the books. He promised to call before sunset. At exactly 5 o'clock, my phone buzzed against the wooden table. The sudden vibration broke the heavy silence. I saw Victor's name flashing on the screen. I answered the call, pressing the phone against my ear. "Do you have the results?" I asked. I heard the rustle of paper followed by a sigh. "I have them, Harrison," Victor replied, his voice sounding grim. "But I need you to brace yourself. Whatever you thought was inside this vial, it is much worse. Tell me what it is, Victor." "It is a drug called haloperidol," he explained slowly. "It is an extremely potent antipsychotic medication. It is administered in psychiatric wards to manage patients with severe schizophrenia. But the sample you gave me is not a standard therapeutic dose. It is a highly concentrated liquid formulation, dangerously strong." I closed my eyes. "Why would my son have antipsychotic medication?" I asked softly. "Because, Harrison, if you covertly slip this specific dosage into the drink of an elderly man, it does not calm him down. It severely poisons his central nervous system. It induces violent muscle spasms, uncontrollable hand tremors, and intense paranoia. It completely shatters short-term memory and causes terrifying hallucinations. To any outside observer, a man exhibiting these symptoms would look exactly like someone suffering from rapid-onset dementia." The phone almost slipped from my trembling hand. The air in my office suddenly felt as thick as concrete. I could not breathe. I could not think. I stared blindly at the wall, listening to the horrifying reality of my son's intentions echoing in my ears. He was not just trying to steal my money. Financial theft is driven by pathetic greed. What Bradley had planned was pure evil. He was plotting to steal my mind. He was going to poison his own father. I thought back to the birthday dinner. I remembered Bradley handing me that mahogany box with an eager smile. I remembered the imported vodka resting on the red velvet. The sickening logic of his plan suddenly clicked into place. He knew perfectly well that I had been completely sober for 25 years. He gave me the liquor hoping I would be tempted to open it, or perhaps he intended to use the vodka to mask the bitter taste of the haloperidol. He wanted me to lose my sobriety and my sanity all at once. He wanted to watch my hands shake. He wanted to watch me forget my own name. He wanted me to stumble around this house completely dependent on him. "Are you still there, Harrison?" Victor asked, his voice cutting through the ringing in my ears. "I am here," I managed to say, forcing the words through a tight throat. "Is it lethal, Victor? Would this dose have killed me?" "Eventually, yes," Victor replied softly. "A prolonged exposure to this concentration would lead to heart failure. But the physical decline would be slow and agonizing. They would have plenty of time to declare you legally incompetent before your heart gave out. Whoever possessed this vial was planning a methodical, torturous execution. You need to contact the authorities immediately." "I will handle it, Victor," I said smoothly, my voice dropping to a freezing register. "Thank you for your immense help. I owe you a great debt." I hung up the phone and let it drop onto my lap. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. The sorrow weighing down my heart completely vanished, burned away by a blinding white-hot fury. My son did not just view me as a walking bank account. He viewed me as an obstacle that needed to be slowly tortured to death. He was willing to strip away my dignity and my life just to fund his miserable existence with a woman who secretly despised him. I looked down at the glowing tablet on my desk. The hidden cameras watched the empty rooms, waiting patiently for the prey to arrive. The trap was set, but now the stakes had fundamentally changed. This was no longer a simple matter of recovering stolen pension funds or firing a corrupt regional director. This was about absolute survival. It was a matter of self-defense against a predator who shared my blood. Bradley wanted to play a game of life and death. He wanted to destroy my mind and lock me away in a dark prison of chemical dementia. I stood up from the armchair, my joints popping loudly in the quiet room. I walked over to the window and looked out at the sprawling Texas landscape I had conquered decades ago. I had fought worse monsters than a spoiled, cowardly boy in a tailored suit. If he wanted to go to war over my life, I was going to give him a war that would echo through the rest of his miserable existence. I was going to tear his entire world apart, piece by broken piece, until he had absolutely nothing left to his name. As I turned away from the window, my phone rang again. This time the screen displayed Mitchell's name. I answered immediately. "We have a massive problem, Harrison," my lawyer said, his voice completely stripped of its usual calm demeanor. "You need to get down to my office right now. I just found out what the drug is actually for, and we are completely out of time." I did not even bother changing my clothes. I threw on a heavy wool coat over my shirt, grabbed my car keys, and walked out into the freezing night. The drive to Mitchell's downtown office was a blur of empty streets and flashing yellow traffic lights. The dashboard clock glowed brightly, showing 2:15 in the morning. My mind raced through 1,000 terrifying possibilities. If Victor Hughes told me the drug was meant to destroy my mind, what could Mitchell have possibly found that was even worse than that? I parked my car illegally on the curb right in front of the towering glass building and used my emergency access card to bypass the lobby security doors. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt like it took an eternity. When the steel doors finally slid open, I saw Mitchell standing in the middle of the hallway waiting for me. He looked terrible. His tie was completely undone, his hair was uncharacteristically messy, and his eyes were bloodshot from staring at computer screens for too many hours. He did not offer a greeting. He simply turned around and led me quickly into his private conference room. The large mahogany table in the center of the room was completely covered in thick stacks of printed legal documents. Mitchell walked over to the table and picked up a heavy file folder with a bright red seal stamped across the top. He held it out to me. His hand was visibly shaking. "Sit down, Harrison." Mitchell instructed, his voice grave and completely devoid of its usual arrogant legal confidence. I took a seat in one of the plush leather chairs, but I did not take the file from his hand. "Just tell me what it is, Mitchell," I said, bracing myself for the impact. Mitchell placed the file gently on the table and leaned forward. "After you told me about the toxicologist report and the antipsychotic drug, something clicked in my brain," he began. "A drug that mimics rapid-onset dementia is an incredibly specific weapon. It is not something you use just to hurt someone. It is something you use to build a very specific legal narrative. So I hacked into the county probate court database. I bypassed the standard public search and went directly into the sealed emergency filings. Harrison, your son is not just trying to poison you. He is actively trying to legally erase you from existence." I frowned, the cold dread creeping back up my spine. "What do you mean, erase me?" I asked. Mitchell opened the red folder and slid a thick document across the smooth wood toward me. "It is a petition for an emergency conservatorship," Mitchell stated flatly. "Bradley filed it 3 days ago. He is asking a judge to declare you completely mentally incompetent and incapable of managing your own affairs." I stared down at the crisp white paper. The legal jargon blurred before my eyes. A conservatorship. That was the legal mechanism used to strip elderly people of their basic human rights. If a judge signed that paper, I would not be allowed to make a single decision for myself. I would not be allowed to drive my truck, choose where I lived, or even access my own bank accounts. I would be completely at the mercy of my guardian. And Bradley had nominated himself as my sole guardian. "Look at the second page," Mitchell ordered gently. I turned the page with trembling fingers. Attached to the legal petition was an official-looking medical document. It was a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation complete with a medical license number and a stamped signature from a private doctor I had never met in my entire life. According to this doctor, I was suffering from severe advanced cognitive decline. The report claimed I was experiencing violent outbursts, chronic memory loss, and that I was a direct physical danger to myself. Bradley bribed a corrupt physician to write a completely fictional medical history. "About you," Mitchell explained, his voice thick with disgust. "The plan was terrifyingly simple and absolutely foolproof. He was going to spike your birthday liquor with that massive dose of haloperidol. By the end of the weekend, the violent tremors and the chemical hallucinations would begin. When the court-appointed evaluator inevitably came to your ranch to verify the claims, in this fake report they would find a rambling, shaking, terrified old man who could not even remember his own name. The drug would provide the perfect physical evidence to back up his fraudulent legal claims. The sheer scale of his calculated cruelty took my breath away. He was going to use my own body as the ultimate evidence against me. He wanted to trap me inside a poisoned mind and then use the court system to lock the cage. But why go through all this legal trouble, I asked, my voice cracking slightly. Why not just steal the money and run? Because of the trust funds and the corporate bylaws, Mitchell answered immediately. If he just steals cash, he is a criminal on the run. But if he gets this conservatorship approved, he gains absolute, unquestioned legal control over your entire $40 million estate. He can liquidate your assets, sell your company, and empty your retirement accounts, all with the full blessing of the state of Texas. It is the ultimate heist. He is using the justice system as his getaway car. I felt a surge of pure adrenaline flood my system. The sadness was gone. The shock was gone. "When is the hearing?" I demanded, sitting up straight in my chair. Mitchell looked me dead in the eyes. "That is the worst part. It is an emergency ex parte hearing. That means Bradley requested the judge to rule on it without you even being present to defend yourself. The hearing is scheduled for this coming Friday morning at 9 o'clock. We have exactly 4 days to stop him right now." I left Mitchell's office and drove back to the ranch in a complete daze. The digital clock on my dashboard glowed with a mocking green light, reminding me that the sun would soon rise on a Tuesday morning. Friday was only 3 days away. 72 hours until a corrupt judge could strike a gavel and legally erase my entire existence. I pulled through my front gates, parked the truck, and walked into my dark, empty house. I did not turn on a single light. I went straight to my home office, locked the heavy oak door behind me, and sat down in the absolute darkness. My heart was pounding a relentless, painful rhythm against my ribs. I needed an advantage. I needed to know exactly what my son was doing while he thought I was isolated on a fishing boat down by the Gulf Coast. I reached across the desk and picked up the encrypted tablet the security technicians had left me. The screen illuminated my tired face with a harsh blue glow. I opened the surveillance application and accessed the secure cloud server. The interface was remarkably intuitive. I selected the timeline feature and began scrubbing backward through the recorded video feeds. I bypassed the hours of empty rooms and static shadows looking for any sign of movement. I stopped when a sudden spike in the audio waveform caught my attention. It was time-stamped just a few hours ago, shortly after sunset on Monday evening. I tapped the screen to play the footage from the main living room camera. The high-definition video buffered for a fraction of a second before springing to life in crystal-clear night vision. The heavy front door swung open, and two figures stepped stealthily into my foyer. It was Bradley and Stephanie. They had used their spare emergency key to enter my home while they firmly believed I was hundreds of miles away without any cellular reception. I watched my son aggressively push past his wife, his face contorted in a mask of pure, unfiltered panic. He practically sprinted into the center of the living room, his eyes darting frantically toward the stone mantel above the fireplace. "Where is it?" Bradley hissed through his teeth, his voice easily picked up by the microscopic audio bugs hidden in the walls. "Where did you put it?" He began tearing through the room. He lifted the decorative sofa cushions, threw my folded reading blankets onto the floor, and violently yanked open the drawers of the antique wooden side tables. He was completely out of control, acting like a desperate addict searching for a hidden stash. Stephanie stood in the doorway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She looked thoroughly annoyed by his frantic behavior, completely oblivious to the catastrophic danger they were actually in. "Are you seriously losing your mind over a stupid bottle of liquor?" she asked, rolling her eyes in exaggerated disgust. "It is just vodka, Bradley. Stop destroying the house. He will notice the mess when he gets back from his pathetic fishing trip." Bradley stopped dead in his tracks. He turned slowly to face her, his hands trembling with a violent, unrestrained fury. "It is not just vodka, you absolute idiot!" he practically screamed, his voice cracking under the immense pressure. I hid the digital master ledger for the Delaware accounts inside the false bottom of that box. All the wire transfers, all the forged signatures, everything is on that memory card. And right next to it is the liquid haloperidol I secured for Friday. I was supposed to take that box directly to the downtown safe deposit vault on Saturday morning so we would have the drug ready for the medical evaluation. "Why did you touch it? Why did you take it out of the trunk of my car?" Stephanie physically recoiled, her arrogant posture instantly crumbling as the horrifying reality of his words crashed into her. The night vision camera captured the exact moment all the blood drained from her face. "You told me you needed to buy him a gift." She stammered, her voice suddenly small and trembling. "You said we needed to play the role of the loving family. I saw the fancy wooden box sitting in the trunk. I thought it was just some corporate promotional garbage you forgot about. I did not want to spend $500 of our own money buying a present for an old man who does not even appreciate the things we do for him. So I wrapped it up and handed it to him." "You wrapped it up and handed it to him," Bradley repeated, his tone dropping to a terrifying hollow whisper. "You took the exact physical evidence that could send us both to federal prison for 20 years, along with the chemical poison we needed to secure the conservatorship, and you gave it to the exact man we are trying to destroy. Do you understand what you have done? If his lawyer finds that hidden compartment, our lives are completely over." Stephanie covered her mouth with trembling hands, stepping back toward the door, as if she was trying to escape her own catastrophic stupidity. But he did not find it, she argued desperately, trying to grasp onto any remaining shred of hope. He told you. The airport security guards threw it away. The old fool is completely clueless. We are still safe. Bradley let out a dry, humorless laugh that echoed chillingly through the empty living room. I sat back in my dark office, a cold, predatory smile slowly spreading across my face. I finally understood the perfect irony of the situation. My son had engineered a brilliant, ruthless, and highly complex trap to steal my wealth and destroy my mind. He had thought of every possible legal and financial angle, but his entire master plan was fundamentally ruined by the simple, petty cheapness of his own manipulative wife. Her blatant greed was their downfall. I kept my eyes glued to the glowing screen, watching their marriage unraveling right in my living room. The argument about the missing mahogany box had burned itself out, leaving a tense silence between them. Bradley collapsed onto the sofa, burying his face in his hands, completely defeated by the reality of their missing evidence. Stephanie was not finished. Her initial shock morphed back into the cold entitlement that I had always despised. She walked over to the antique side table, casually adjusted a picture frame she had knocked over during the frantic search, and crossed her arms. "We have a bigger problem than your misplaced wooden box," she stated coldly, her voice echoing clearly. "My monthly allowance from the offshore account did not clear this morning. The bank flagged the transfer because you changed the routing numbers again without telling me. I need that money by tomorrow, Bradley. I have expenses." Bradley slowly lowered his hands. He looked up at his wife, his face a mask of pure exhaustion and deep resentment. "Expenses," he repeated, his voice dripping with bitter sarcasm. "You mean your personal training sessions? Is that what we are calling it now?" Stephanie did not flinch. She stood perfectly still, looking down at her husband with an expression of absolute contempt. "Yes," she replied flatly. "My sessions are very important to me. I need the $50,000 transferred to my private account by noon tomorrow." I sat forward in my dark office, my brow furrowing in confusion. $50,000 for personal training. That was an absurd amount of money, even for someone as relentlessly materialistic as my daughter-in-law. I turned up the volume on the tablet, listening intently as the ugly truth of their dynamic was finally dragged out into the harsh light. "Do you really think I am completely blind?" Bradley snapped, his voice rising in a sudden burst of pathetic anger. "Do you think I do not look at the credit card statements you leave lying around the house? I know exactly where the money from the workers' pension fund is going. You are not paying for fitness advice. You are funding the lavish lifestyle of a 25-year-old boy." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Stephanie was having a brazen affair. She was taking the money that my loyal employees had bled for the retirement funds that were supposed to protect them in their old age, and she was using it to buy the affection of a young lover. "I know about the luxury sports car you leased for him last month." Bradley continued, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and deep humiliation. "I know about the expensive watches and the weekend trips to the coast when you tell me you are visiting your mother. You are spending the money we stole from my father to play sugar mommy to a kid who is barely out of college. It is disgusting, Stephanie. It is absolutely pathetic." For a brief moment, I expected her to deny it. I expected the standard tears and the frantic apologies that usually accompany a discovered affair. But Stephanie did not shed a single tear. She did not even attempt to defend herself. Instead, a slow, predatory smile spread across her face. She took a step closer to the sofa, looking down at my son as if he were nothing more than an annoying insect. "And what exactly are you going to do about it?" she asked softly, her voice laced with venomous authority. "Are you going to cut off my allowance? Are you going to file for a messy public divorce? Let me remind you of a few very important details, my sweet husband, whose signature is on every single one of those fake invoices we send to your company. whose name is listed as the primary co-director on all four of the Delaware shell companies. Bradley remained completely silent. He stared at the floor, his shoulders slumping in total defeat. "That is right," Stephanie whispered, leaning in closer. "We are in this together. If you try to restrict my spending, or if you ever try to leave me, I will march straight down to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I will hand them all the forged documents, and I will testify that you forced me to sign them under extreme duress. I will play the naive, abused wife, and you will spend the next 20 years in a maximum security prison. So you are going to fix the routing numbers, and you are going to transfer my $50,000 tomorrow morning. Because without my signatures on Friday, your plan to lock your father in a mental ward completely falls apart." I watched my son on the screen. The boy I had raised. The boy I had sacrificed everything to protect simply nodded his head. "Okay," he whispered, his voice completely broken. "I will make the transfer in the morning. Just please make sure you are ready for the court evaluator on Friday." I turned off the tablet and plunged my office into darkness. My hands were shaking not from fear or sorrow. I was trembling with overwhelming disgust. Bradley was not just a criminal. He was not just a greedy, manipulative monster who wanted to poison his own father. He was a spineless, pathetic coward. He was fully aware that his wife was sleeping with another man, funding her infidelity with stolen money, and he accepted it because he was too terrified to face the consequences of his own financial crimes. He traded his pride, his dignity, and my life to keep a vicious woman compliant. He was a hollow shell of a man, driven entirely by fear and weakness. And in that moment, any lingering hesitation I might have felt about destroying him completely vanished. I was no longer fighting my son. I was putting down a rabid animal that infected my quiet home. The next morning, I woke up before the sun even considered rising. I did not feel the bone-deep exhaustion that usually follows a sleepless night. Instead, I felt a strange, cold clarity. The mourning period for my son was officially over. I was no longer a grieving father trying to understand where he went wrong. I was a hunter. I dressed in a sharp charcoal suit and walked out the front door, leaving my dark, empty house behind me. I drove to a dilapidated neon-lit diner on an abandoned highway outside the county line. I slid into a booth at the back, ordered coffee, and waited in the dim shadows of the early morning. At exactly 6 in the morning, the rusty bells on the diner door jingled loudly. A tall, impeccably dressed man walked in looking completely out of place among the grease-stained tables and faded linoleum. His name was Richard Blackwood. For the past 20 years, Richard and I had been locked in a brutal, cutthroat corporate war. He owned the second-largest construction supply conglomerate in Texas, and we had spent 2 decades stealing clients from each other. If you had asked me a week ago if I would ever sit across from him, I would have laughed. But desperate times require unholy alliances, and I needed his deep pockets. Richard spotted me in the back booth and walked over with a cautious, calculating expression. He simply slid into the booth opposite me, waving away the waitress. "You know, Harrison," he began, his voice smooth and dripping with suspicion. "When I got your secure message at 3 in the morning, I thought it was a prank. What exactly are we doing here?" I took a slow sip of my coffee, maintaining absolute eye contact. "We are here to make history," Richard said quietly. "I am going to offer you the one thing you have spent the last 20 years dreaming about, but could never quite manage to take from me." Richard leaned back against the vinyl seat, crossing his arms over his expensive Italian suit. His eyes narrowed. "I am listening," he murmured. I reached inside my suit jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. I placed it perfectly in the center of the sticky table. Mitchell had been up all night drafting this specific document. "Inside that envelope is a legally binding transfer of ownership," I explained, keeping my tone strictly professional. "I am offering you my 51% controlling stake in my company. I am handing you the keys to my entire empire." Richard stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. He let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. "You are out of your mind," he said, shaking his head. You built that company with your bare hands. You would rather burn it to the ground than sell it to me. What is the catch? Are you facing a massive federal audit? Are the supply chains collapsing? The company is perfectly healthy, I replied smoothly. The books are balanced. The contracts are solid, and the revenue is exactly what you think it is. But I am an old man, Richard. I am tired of the daily grind. I want out, and I want out immediately. I am offering you absolute market dominance in the state of Texas. With my company under your belt, you will have a complete monopoly. Richard slowly uncrossed his arms. The sheer magnitude of the offer was beginning to penetrate his thick skepticism. He reached out and placed his hand on the envelope. "And what is the price for this sudden, miraculous surrender?" he asked, his voice dropping to an eager whisper. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table. "The current market valuation of my controlling shares is roughly $35 million, I stated factually. I will sell them to you today for exactly $20 million, a massive, unprecedented discount." Richard visibly flinched. The absolute shock on his face was genuine. A $15 million discount was unheard of in our industry. Nobody walked away from that kind of money unless their house was actively on fire. "There is only one condition," I continued, not allowing him a single second to recover his composure. "The $20 million must be paid in pure, untraceable cash, and it must be wired directly into an offshore, irrevocable trust account located in the Cayman Islands. Furthermore, the transaction must be fully completed and legally binding within the next 48 hours. If the money is not in that specific account by Thursday night, the deal is completely void." Richard stared at me, his sharp mind racing to process the terms. An irrevocable trust meant the money was completely untouchable by any domestic legal action, including any potential conservatorship that a corrupt court might try to enforce. He did not know my personal reasons, and he did not care. He only saw the greatest financial victory of his entire life sitting on a dirty diner table. "You want $20 million in liquid cash moved internationally." "In 2 days," he clarified, tapping his fingers against the table. "That is a massive logistical nightmare, Harrison." I did not flinch. "That is the price of the crown, Richard. Can you do it? Or should I call our competitors in Dallas?" Richard looked at the envelope, then looked back at me. A predatory smile broke across his face. He pulled out a pen and opened the envelope. He flipped to the final page and signed his name with a flourish. He slid the documents back across the table. "You will have your money by Thursday evening, Harrison," he promised, his eyes gleaming with greedy triumph. "It is a pleasure doing business with you." I nodded slowly, a cold satisfaction settling deep within my chest. My son thought he was the master of my company. He had no idea he was now the regional director of absolutely nothing. I left the diner and drove back to the glass building downtown. Mitchell was already waiting in his office. He had not slept. When I handed him the signed contract from Richard, a genuine smile broke across his exhausted face. He took the envelope, pulled out the document, and carefully inspected the signature. "This is it, Harrison," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a judge reading a verdict. "The dominoes are falling, but we have a massive amount of work to do before that money hits the account." I sat down in the leather chair, feeling a surge of relentless energy. The adrenaline was keeping my aging body running at full speed. "Tell me exactly what happens next," I instructed him. Mitchell walked to his whiteboard and uncapped a marker. He drew a box in the center and wrote the word "trust" inside it. "This is your new fortress," he explained, tapping the board. "We are establishing an offshore irrevocable trust. The word irrevocable is the key here. Once transferred into this legal structure, you no longer technically own them. The trust owns them. You are merely the beneficiary." I nodded, following his logic. "And if I do not legally own the assets," I said, "then a court-appointed guardian cannot access them." "Exactly." Mitchell confirmed, his eyes gleaming with legal malice. even if Bradley bribes more doctors and wins the conservatorship. On Friday morning, he will be appointed as the legal guardian of an old man who has absolutely nothing to his name. The $40 million estate will completely vanish into thin air. He will inherit control over a ghost. The $20 million from the company sale was only part of my wealth. I had millions more in bank accounts, real estate holdings, and portfolios. Over the next 48 hours, Mitchell and his team worked around the clock to systematically liquidate and transfer every single penny I possessed. It was a silent, magnificent financial guillotine dropping down on my son's future. I sat beside Mitchell at his desk, signing endless stacks of digital transfer authorizations. We started with the joint family accounts. Years ago, I foolishly added Bradley as an authorized signer on my primary accounts in case of an emergency. He used those accounts as a personal safety net, dipping in to cover country club dues or Stephanie's shopping sprees. With 3 clicks of a mouse, Mitchell drained those accounts completely dry. He moved over $6 million in cash straight into the impenetrable offshore trust. Next came the corporate lifelines. Bradley lived a lifestyle of extreme luxury, but very little of it was actually paid for with his own salary. He survived on the company's prestigious black credit cards. He used them for expensive dinners, first-class flights, and high-end hotels, always classifying them as vague business expenses. I picked up the phone and called the executive account manager at the Platinum Credit Bureau. I identified myself as the majority shareholder and the primary guarantor. I instructed the manager to immediately freeze every single card issued under Bradley Caldwell's name. "Cancel them all," I said, keeping my voice completely devoid of emotion. "Flag them as stolen if you must, but ensure that not a single transaction goes through, starting right this second." The manager agreed without hesitation. In less than 10 minutes, my son's primary source of daily funding was completely obliterated. He was walking around the city wearing a $3,000 suit, completely unaware that his wallet was full of useless plastic. If you are listening to this and you agree that a father must do whatever it takes to protect his legacy from greedy vultures, please hit the like button right now. Leave a comment telling me if you have ever had to cut a toxic family member out of your life to survive. It is the hardest decision a parent can make, but sometimes severe financial discipline is the only language a traitor truly understands. Make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss the final showdown, because what happens next is something he never saw coming. By late Wednesday afternoon, the financial extraction was completely finished. My sprawling estate, my vintage car collection, my personal investments, and the massive cash reserves were all legally swallowed by the offshore trust. And then, right before the banks closed for the day, the crown jewel arrived. Mitchell's computer chimed with a high-priority notification. He opened the secure banking portal and turned the monitor toward me. A wire transfer from Richard Blackwood's holding company had just cleared international customs. $20 million in untraceable cash had safely landed in the Cayman Islands account. The deal was officially done. I did not own the civil construction supply empire anymore. I was completely unburdened. Mitchell closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair, letting out a heavy sigh of relief. "We did it, Harrison," he said. "You are officially bulletproof. Bradley cannot touch a single dime. Even if he wins the conservatorship hearing on Friday, all he will get is the right to pay your grocery bills." I looked out the window, watching the busy city streets below. A cold satisfaction settled into my bones. The defensive preparations were complete. My assets were safe. My legacy was secure. But protecting my money was not enough. I did not just want to survive his attack. I wanted to destroy him. I wanted to watch the arrogance melt off his face. I wanted to see the exact moment he realized his life was over. I turned back to Mitchell, my expression hardening into stone. "Now that the money is safe," I said quietly, "it is time to set the final trap. Draft a new will, Mitchell. Make it look exactly like what he wants to see. We are inviting them over for dinner. It will be a final meal they will never forget for as long as they live on this earth. Mitchell nodded slowly, a dark smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He turned back to his keyboard and began to type with a renewed vicious energy. We spent the next hour crafting the perfect piece of bait. The decoy will was an absolute masterpiece of legal fiction. On paper, it looked perfectly authentic. It was printed on thick, watermarked parchment, complete with the official letterhead of Mitchell's esteemed law firm. The text explicitly outlined the immediate transfer of all my executive voting shares, full power of attorney, and absolute control over my entire $40 million estate directly to my son, Bradley Caldwell. It was exactly the specific document my son had been trying to force into existence through his fraudulent conservatorship petition. But legally, it was completely worthless. It was a binding contract promising control over assets that I no longer owned. Thursday morning arrived with a heavy gray sky. It was exactly 24 hours before the corrupt judge was scheduled to review Bradley's secret emergency petition at the county courthouse. Time was rapidly running out, but I was no longer afraid of the ticking clock. I drove back to my ranch, the heavy decoy document resting on the passenger seat beside me. When I walked through the front door, the house was completely silent, exactly as I had left it. The hidden surveillance cameras were still recording every empty room, waiting patiently for the final act of this tragedy to begin. I walked into my kitchen and poured myself a glass of ice water. I needed to clear my throat. I needed to prepare for the absolute most important performance of my entire life. I had to convince the man who was actively trying to destroy my mind that his poison was already working. I took a deep breath, letting my shoulders slump heavily. I practiced making my hands tremble. I closed my eyes and imagined the absolute terror of losing my memories, letting that profound vulnerability seep into my vocal cords. When I felt entirely ready, I picked up my cell phone and dialed my son's personal number. The phone rang 3 times before Bradley answered. "Hello, Dad," he said. His tone was casual, but there was a sharp underlying edge of anxiety in his voice. He was likely stressed about the impending court hearing the next morning. "Bradley," I murmured. I kept my voice incredibly soft, letting it waver and crack on the syllables. I paused for a long moment, breathing heavily into the microphone. "Are you there, son?" "I am here, Dad." "Are you okay? You sound terrible." The fake concern in his voice made my stomach turn, but I leaned completely into the deception. "I am not okay." "Bradley," I whispered, forcing a slight pathetic wheeze into my breath. "I am so confused. I woke up this morning, and I could not remember where I put my keys. I could not remember the name of the street I live on for almost 10 minutes. Something is very wrong with my head, son. My memory is fading so fast. It is like there is a thick fog inside my brain, and I cannot see through it anymore." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. He absolutely thought the poison was finally taking effect. He thought the heavy dose of haloperidol from the birthday bottle had successfully entered my system. He was practically vibrating with excitement. "Dad." "You need to calm down," Bradley said, his voice suddenly adopting a sickeningly sweet, patronizing tone. "You are just getting older. It is perfectly natural to have some moments of confusion. I am coming over right now to take you to a doctor." "No," I interrupted, injecting a note of desperate panic into my trembling voice. "No doctors, Bradley. Please. I do not want to be locked away in some cold hospital. Listen to me." I had a long talk with Mitchell before he left for London. I told him I cannot run the company anymore. I am too weak. My mind is slipping away. He drafted a new will for me. The silence that followed was absolute. I could picture him standing frozen in his luxurious office, his heart pounding against his ribs. "A new will," Bradley echoed, his voice barely more than a breathless whisper. "Yes." I continued, sounding utterly defeated and exhausted. I am transferring everything to you, Bradley. All my voting shares, the executive control, the property deeds. I am signing it all over to you. I just want to rest. I want you to take care of the business so I do not have to worry anymore. Please come over for dinner tonight. Bring Stephanie. I want to sign the paperwork tonight while my mind is still clear enough to hold a pen. I need my family with me. He did not hesitate. The sheer blinding magnitude of his greed completely overshadowed any lingering caution. He had spent months carefully plotting a hostile, illegal takeover through the probate court, and now I was offering him the entire kingdom on a silver platter without a single fight. Of course, Dad Bradley practically gasped. We will be there tonight. I will bring dinner. Do not worry about anything. I will take care of everything from now on. You just rest. We will be there by 7. Thank you, son, I whispered, and I slowly disconnected the call. I set the phone down on the kitchen counter and looked out the window at the sprawling Texas landscape. I imagined Stephanie's reaction when Bradley called her with the amazing news. She would likely be picking out her next luxury vehicle, secure in the knowledge that her expensive personal training sessions would continue uninterrupted forever. They both believed they had won the ultimate prize. They believed they had conquered the old wolf. My son thought he had completely outsmarted me. He thought he had successfully manipulated a frail, dying old man into surrendering a lifetime of hard work. He was completely blinded by his own profound arrogance, unable to see the massive steel jaws of the trap slowly closing around his neck. I walked into my formal dining room. The heavy oak table sat empty in the fading afternoon light. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the forged documents Mitchell had prepared. I laid the decoy will perfectly in the center of the table, smoothing out the thick parchment paper with a steady hand. I placed a heavy silver fountain pen right beside it, lining it up perfectly parallel to the signature line. The stage was finally set for the grand finale. I stood back and admired the arrangement. It was time to welcome the traders home for their very last meal. I moved from the beautiful dining room into the kitchen. I carefully tied an apron around my waist and began to prepare the meal. I seasoned the ribeye steaks with salt and pepper, letting them rest while I heated the cast-iron skillet. The sizzling sound of the meat hitting the hot oil filled the kitchen, sending a rich aroma through the house. It was a comforting smell, one that usually signaled a joyous gathering. Tonight, however, it felt different. I was cooking a feast for my worst enemies. I flipped the steaks, watching the dark crust form, and thought about the audacity of what they were planning tomorrow morning. They wanted to strip away my freedom, and here I was basting their dinner with garlic and herbs. I took the steaks off the heat and began preparing roasted asparagus and mashed potatoes. Once the food was simmering, I walked back into the dining room to finish setting the oak table. I brought out the heavy crystal water glasses Martha and I received as a wedding gift 50 years ago. I polished the heavy silver cutlery until it gleamed under the warm glow of the chandelier. Then I went to my private wine cellar. I bypassed the expensive bottles of imported red wine and deliberately selected a very cheap, generic bottle of table wine. I poured it into an ornate glass decanter to make it look incredibly refined. I was not about to waste a vintage reserve bottle on two people who belonged in a dark federal prison. I set the decanter right next to the thick decoy will, making sure everything looked like a scene of quiet domestic surrender. As I was adjusting the linen napkins, a soft rhythmic knock came from the heavy door at the back of the kitchen. It was exactly 6 o'clock. The guests of honor had not arrived yet, but my true allies had. I unlocked the door and let them quietly step inside. Mitchell Reed walked in first, carrying his signature leather briefcase. Right behind him was a tall, imposing man wearing a sharp gray suit. He had a stern face, piercing blue eyes, and carried an aura of absolute authority. This was Special Agent Carter from the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Bringing up the rear, wearing his official uniform with his silver badge shining brightly on his chest, was our local county sheriff. We did not exchange any polite pleasantries. The immense gravity of the situation filled the room, making small talk entirely unnecessary. I offered them fresh coffee, but all three men politely declined. Mitchell set his briefcase on the kitchen island and snapped the locks open. He pulled out thick stacks of legal files, wire transfer logs, and the highly incriminating toxicologist report. He handed the thick folders directly to Agent Carter. "We have completely verified the offshore shell companies," Mitchell explained softly. "The paper trail directly links your son and his wife to the systematic embezzlement of the employee pension funds. Furthermore, the sheriff has personally reviewed the hidden camera footage and the chemical analysis of the haloperidol poison. They have absolutely everything they need to make the arrests tonight." Agent Carter flipped through the dense pages, his expression hardening. "The financial fraud alone carries a heavy federal sentence," Carter stated in a deep, steady voice. "But the conspiracy to poison an elderly family member elevates this to another level entirely." I thanked the men for coming on short notice. The sheriff placed a heavy, comforting hand on my shoulder. "You have done a remarkably brave thing today, Harrison," the sheriff said kindly. "Most parents would simply look the other way or try to handle it quietly behind closed doors. It takes a very strong man to hold his own blood accountable for their actions." I appreciated his words, but I felt absolutely no pride. I felt only a cold, empty resolve. I led the three men down the long hallway toward my private home office. This room was soundproofed, built specifically for confidential business negotiations. I unlocked the heavy oak door and ushered them inside. The room was dark, illuminated only by a small brass reading lamp on my desk. I pointed toward the comfortable leather armchairs positioned in the shadows of the room. "I need you to stay in here and keep the door tightly closed," I instructed them softly. I rigged the security tablet to broadcast the live audio feed from the dining room directly to a speaker hidden in this office. "You will be able to hear every single word they say. When the time is right, I will open the door and call you out." Mitchell nodded, settling into a chair and opening his encrypted laptop. Agent Carter and the sheriff took their positions, their facial expressions locked into rigid professional stoicism. I pulled the heavy office door shut, ensuring the brass lock clicked silently into place. I walked back down the long hallway toward the dining room. The house was once again perfectly quiet, save for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock standing in the foyer. The trap was fully loaded. The authorities were waiting patiently in the shadows of my home. The forged legal documents were sitting on the table, and the dinner was hot and ready to be served. I walked over to the front window and looked out at the long gravel driveway leading up to my house. The sun had finally dipped entirely below the horizon, casting the sprawling ranch in deep twilight. I stood perfectly still, watching the darkness, and waited for the bright headlights of my son's luxury car to pierce through the night. I wondered if he felt any guilt at all, or if he was simply counting the hours until he could officially declare me insane. I smoothed the wrinkles out of my suit jacket and took a steady breath, preparing myself to look the devil in the eye. The twin beams of expensive LED headlights swept across the dark gravel of my long driveway, cutting violently through the peaceful twilight. I stood perfectly still by the front window, partially hidden by the heavy velvet drapes, and watched my son pull his pristine black car up to the main entrance. The engine purred to a silent halt. Before I walked to the front door, I glanced down at the security tablet resting on the entryway table. The high-definition night vision cameras captured them stepping out of the vehicle. Bradley was wearing a dark, impeccably tailored suit, looking every inch the wealthy executive he desperately pretended to be. Stephanie stepped out of the passenger side, her high heels clicking sharply against the stone pavement. She was carrying an oversized, incredibly expensive designer handbag. The camera zoomed in slightly as she paused by the front bumper. I watched her look at Bradley, flash a cold, predatory smile, and pat the side of her leather purse twice with her manicured fingers. I knew exactly what was inside that bag. Mitchell had warned me about the emergency protocols for involuntary psychiatric commitment. Along with the stolen haloperidol, Stephanie was carrying the forged medical evaluation and the emergency psychiatric hold papers. Their dark plan was sickeningly clear to me now. They intended to sit at my table, feed me a lavish meal, and coax me into signing the decoy will. Once they had my legally binding signature transferring the entire $40 million estate into their greedy hands, Bradley would offer a celebratory toast. He would slip the lethal dose of antipsychotic medication into my wine glass. They would sit there and watch me drink it. They would watch my hands begin to shake. They would watch my mind shatter into terrified confusion. And then Stephanie would pull those legal papers from her designer bag and dial emergency services. An ambulance would arrive in the middle of the night to haul a raving, poisoned old man away to a locked psychiatric ward, leaving them in absolute control of my house and my legacy. The heavy brass knocker sounded against the solid oak of my front door, pulling me out of my dark thoughts. I took a deep breath, let my shoulders slump forward to mimic a defeated posture, and allowed a slight tremor to enter my hands. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open slowly. Bradley stood on the porch, his face arranged into a mask of deep artificial concern. Stephanie was right beside him, her eyes wide with fake sympathy. Dad, Bradley said, his voice dripping with exaggerated gentleness as he stepped forward to embrace me. He wrapped his arms around my shoulders, patting my back as if comforting a frightened child. I let myself lean into him heavily, playing the part of the broken man he expected to find. "Thank you for coming, son," I whispered, making sure my voice sounded incredibly fragile and weak. "I am so glad you are both here. I do not feel like myself today. The fog in my head is getting so much worse." Stephanie stepped over the threshold, bringing with her the overpowering scent of expensive floral perfume. "Oh, Harrison," she cooed softly, reaching out to gently squeeze my forearm. "You poor thing. Do not worry about a single thing tonight. Bradley and I are going to take wonderful care of you. We are family, and family always looks out for each other." Hearing those words come out of her mouth almost made me physically sick. I looked at her designer purse securely tucked under her arm and thought about the poison and the psychiatric hold papers waiting inside. I gave her a weak, trembling smile and gestured for them to follow me into the house. "Come inside," I murmured. I made steaks. I wanted us to have a nice family dinner before we take care of the paperwork. Bradley quickly took off his suit jacket and hung it in the coat closet, already moving with the confident swagger of a man who owned the entire property. "Smells delicious, Dad," he said, rubbing his hands together. "Let us get you sat down so you can rest your legs." He guided me into the formal dining room by my elbow, acting like my personal caretaker. The moment we crossed the threshold, both of their eyes instantly locked onto the heavy oak table. Right next to the crystal decanter of cheap table wine sat the thick, watermarked parchment of the decoy will, accompanied by the heavy silver fountain pen. I watched a sudden, uncontrollable flash of pure, unadulterated greed illuminate his face. His eyes widened, and he actually licked his lips in anticipation. He quickly masked his excitement, turning back to me with a somber expression. "I see you have the documents ready," he noted quietly. "Yes," I replied, lowering myself slowly into the chair at the head of the table. "I read through it all afternoon. It is exactly what we discussed. Everything goes to you. I just need you to look over the clauses before I sign my name. I want to make absolutely sure the company is in the right hands." Bradley practically vibrated with excitement as he pulled out a chair for his wife. Stephanie sat down gracefully, placing her dangerous leather handbag carefully on the empty chair beside her. She kept her hand resting protectively over the clasp. Bradley took his seat on my right side, perfectly positioned to reach the crystal wine decanter. They looked at the delicious food, the forged legal papers, and their seemingly broken father. They thought they were the smartest people in the entire world. They had absolutely no idea that their worst nightmare was currently waiting behind the locked office door. The stage was set. The final act of their pathetic deception was about to unfold right before my eyes. All I had to do was play along for a few more minutes. The dinner progressed with a layer of false domestic bliss. We ate the perfectly seared steaks, roasted asparagus, and mashed potatoes. I forced myself to chew slowly, letting my hand shake just enough to drop my fork against the plate. When the silver clattered, Bradley patted my arm with hollow encouragement. "You are doing great, Dad," he would say, his eyes darting toward the forged documents resting on the table. "Just take your time. There is no rush." Stephanie played her part with equal devotion. She poured the cheap table wine from the crystal decanter. She had not added the poison yet. I knew she was waiting for the final signature, waiting for the moment my life officially belonged to them, before delivering the fatal dose. They wanted to celebrate their ultimate victory while I swallowed my own destruction. I took a small sip of the wine, staring at the two monsters in my dining room. The conversation was agonizing. Bradley talked endlessly about the future of the company, dismissing the careers of my oldest managers between bites of steak. Stephanie complained about her landscaping, oblivious that her fraudulent lifestyle was about to collapse. I listened to their arrogant chatter, rubbing my temples as if fighting off a terrible headache. The performance drained me, but the thought of the men waiting silently in my soundproofed office kept my resolve completely unshaken. Finally, the grueling meal came to an end. Stephanie cleared the empty plates with practiced elegance, leaving only the wine glasses, the decanter, and the decoy will on the smooth oak surface. Bradley leaned forward, unable to mask his aggressive eagerness any longer. "Well, Dad," he said, his voice dropping to a serious, businesslike tone, "we should probably get this paperwork sorted out so you can get some proper rest. You look completely exhausted." I let out a long, heavy sigh, sinking deeper into my chair. "I am exhausted, Bradley," I whispered, staring blankly at the thick parchment paper. "My eyes are so tired. The light in this dining room is giving me a terrible headache. I do not think I can read all these legal clauses right now." A brief flash of sheer panic crossed my son's face. He tapped his fingers nervously against the table. "You do not have to read every single line, Dad," he urged, a hint of desperate pressure leaking into his voice. "It is exactly what you asked your lawyer to draft. It just transfers the voting rights and the estate management over to me. You just need to sign the last page." I slowly shook my head, pressing my trembling fingers against my forehead. "I know, son," I murmured, "but I want to do this right. Let us move into my private study. The lighting is much softer in there, and the leather chairs are better for my aching back. Bring the documents and the wine. We can finish our drinks and sign the papers in peace." Bradley exchanged a quick, meaningful glance with Stephanie. A silent communication passed between them, a shared acknowledgement that the final phase of their dark plan was rapidly approaching. Stephanie gave a barely perceptible nod, her hand instinctively drifting toward the heavy designer purse resting on the chair beside her. "Perfect idea, Dad," Bradley agreed smoothly. He stood up, grabbed the forged will and the silver fountain pen, and carefully picked up the crystal decanter. Stephanie grabbed her purse and my wineglass. I pushed my chair back and stood up on shaky legs. Bradley immediately stepped to my side, gripping my elbow tightly to support my intentionally unsteady weight. I allowed him to guide me out of the dining room and into the long, dimly lit hallway. The walk to my office felt like a slow, deliberate march to the executioner's block. But they did not realize who the executioner truly was. The wooden floorboards creaked softly beneath our feet. The silence in the house was heavy, thick with the electric anticipation of their impending triumph. Bradley walked with his chest puffed out, radiating a smug, victorious energy. He truly believed he was mere seconds away from inheriting a massive empire. We reached the end of the hallway. The heavy oak door of my private study loomed before us, firmly closed and silent. I reached out with a trembling hand and grasped the cool brass knob. I paused for a single second, letting out one final shaky breath, and then I turned the handle. I pushed the heavy door open, and stepped aside, allowing the dim light to spill into the darkened room. Bradley stepped proudly through the doorway, holding the documents and the wine decanter like a conquering king claiming his throne. Stephanie followed closely behind him, clutching her purse tightly against her son. The room was mostly dark, illuminated only by the warm, golden pool of light cast by the brass reading lamp on my wooden desk. But the light was more than enough to reveal the three imposing figures waiting silently in the shadows. Bradley froze, completely solid. His expensive leather shoes stopped dead on the vintage rug. The smug, arrogant smile that had been permanently plastered across his face all evening vanished in a fraction of a second. It was replaced by a look of sheer, uncomprehending horror. Sitting perfectly still in the guest chairs were Mitchell Reed Special Agent Carter and the county sheriff. Bradley stood paralyzed. The fragile old man act fell away from me instantly. I stood up straight, my posture completely commanding. I walked past my frozen son and sat heavily in my leather armchair. I reached into my desk drawer, pulled out a thick Cuban cigar, and grabbed my silver lighter. The metallic click echoed loudly like a gunshot. I held the flame to the tip, taking a slow pull until the tobacco glowed bright orange. I exhaled a thick cloud of smoke, looking directly into my son's terrified eyes, and the trap finally sprang shut. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the soft, rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock out in the hallway. Bradley stood perfectly rigid, his expensive leather shoes glued to the vintage rug. He looked at Mitchell, then at the federal agent, and finally at the sheriff, his mind frantically trying to comprehend the sheer magnitude of the disaster unfolding right in front of his eyes. The crystal decanter of cheap wine slipped from his trembling hands, crashing onto the hardwood floor. The dark red liquid pooled around his feet like blood. Stephanie let out a short, high-pitched gasp, clutching her designer purse so tightly, her knuckles turned completely white. Neither of them dared to speak a single word. They were utterly paralyzed by the terrifying realization that their brilliant, foolproof plan had been completely dismantled. I leaned forward in my leather armchair, resting my forearms on the heavy oak desk. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of anger. I moved with the cold, methodical precision of a man who had already won the war. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out the shattered remnants of the mahogany presentation box. I tossed the broken pieces of wood and crushed red velvet onto the center of the desk. They landed with a heavy final thud. Right next to the broken wood, I placed the tiny black micro-memory card. "Do you recognize these items, Bradley?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm and perfectly steady. "I found them hidden inside the false bottom of your very thoughtful birthday gift." It turns out Mitchell is quite proficient at discovering hidden compartments. It also turns out that those little digital files contain a complete unedited record of the 4 shell companies you registered in Delaware. $8 million, son. You drained $8 million from the hard-working men and women who built the foundation of your privileged life. Special Agent Carter here has spent the last 2 days verifying every single forged invoice and fraudulent wire transfer you authorized. Bradley opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His jaw worked up and down as if he were suffocating on the heavy air in the room. He took a stumbling step backward, desperately trying to put distance between himself and the undeniable physical evidence of his financial crimes. "But we both know the money was only the beginning." I continued, my tone growing even colder. I reached back into the drawer and pulled out a thick stack of medical papers. It was the official toxicology report from Dr. Victor Hughes. I slapped the heavy document down right next to the memory card. The loud smack made Stephanie physically flinch. "Do you know what haloperidol is, Bradley? Because I certainly do now. It is a highly restricted, incredibly potent antipsychotic medication. The exact kind of chemical poison that induces violent hand tremors, terrifying hallucinations, and rapid memory loss in elderly patients. The exact kind of symptoms that would perfectly match the forged psychiatric evaluation you paid a corrupt doctor to write. The federal agent stood up from his chair in the shadows, stepping into the warm pool of light cast by the desk lamp. His imposing presence seemed to suck all the remaining oxygen out of the room. "We know about the emergency conservatorship petition you filed with the county probate court," Agent Carter stated, his deep voice echoing with absolute legal authority. "We know you planned to poison your father tonight, force his signature on a fraudulent will, and have him involuntarily committed to a locked psychiatric ward by tomorrow morning. We have tracked the bribery payments to the physician, and we have fully documented your conspiracy to commit severe elder abuse." Stephanie began to tremble violently. She looked at her husband with wide, terrified eyes, silently begging him to fix the catastrophic situation. But Bradley was completely broken. He began to hyperventilate, his chest heaving as he gasped for thin, useless air. I was not finished with them yet. I picked up a small remote control resting near my brass lamp and pointed it toward the large flat-screen television mounted on the far wall of the study. I pressed a single button. The screen instantly flickered to life, displaying the high-definition night vision footage from my living room camera. The crisp audio filled the quiet study, echoing their own venomous words right back at them. The video showed Stephanie standing in my house looking incredibly annoyed. I watched her face on the screen as she openly mocked me. "See the digital version of," Stephanie whispered arrogantly. "I told you the clueless old man would buy it. We are perfectly safe." The real Stephanie let out a horrified whimper, taking a desperate step backward until her back hit the solid wooden door. But the video continued to play, moving to the devastating argument they had shared just a few nights ago. The speakers broadcasted her cold, demanding voice as she complained about her stolen allowance. It broadcasted her bragging about the payments she needed for her 25-year-old trainer. It broadcasted her viciously threatening to send her own husband to federal prison if he ever tried to cut off the funding for her young lover. It even broadcasted her cruel complaints about the smell of old people in my house. I paused the video right on a close-up frame of Stephanie's sneering, triumphant face. I set the remote down and looked at my daughter-in-law. She turned ghost white. The untouchable facade she wore for years shattered into tiny pieces. Her knees buckled under the immense weight of her exposed infidelity and her malicious cruelty. The heavy purse slipped from her fingers, crashing onto the floor. The clasp popped open, spilling the forged psychiatric papers and the unlabeled vial of liquid onto my rug. Bradley dropped to his knees, clutching his chest. The vial of clear liquid rolled across the vintage Persian rug, coming to a stop, just inches from Bradley's knees. He stared at it as if it were a live grenade. The undeniable physical proof of his monstrous betrayal was now resting in plain sight, illuminated by the warm light of my desk lamp. He gasped for air, his perfectly tailored suit wrinkling as he slumped forward. Stephanie was sobbing openly now, her hands covering her face to hide her absolute shame. But my son, ever the arrogant narcissist, could not accept the reality of his complete defeat. I watched the gears turning in his panicked mind as he desperately tried to find a way out of the corner he had painted himself into. He slowly pushed himself up from the floor, his legs wobbling beneath him. He wiped the cold sweat from his pale forehead and tried to summon the fake authority he had wielded just moments before in the dining room. He looked at Mitchell, then at the federal agent, before turning his desperate eyes back to me. He was going to try and gaslight me one last time. "Dad, you are incredibly confused right now," Bradley stammered, his voice shaking violently as he pointed a trembling finger at the spilled documents on the floor. "You are having a severe paranoid episode. This is exactly why we needed to get you medical help. You do not know what you are doing. I am the chief executive officer of our family business. You cannot just bring federal agents into our private home and make these wild, baseless accusations. You cannot do this to our company. The board of directors will not stand for this kind of public scandal. I will call corporate security. I will have my own legal team handle this massive misunderstanding." He puffed out his chest, trying to project the image of a powerful corporate leader defending his legitimate empire. He actually believed that his fancy title could somehow shield him from the crushing weight of federal law. He thought he still held the winning cards, desperately clinging to the false hope that his perfectly tailored executive image could save him from the absolute truth. I let him finish his pathetic little speech. I took another slow, deliberate drag from my Cuban cigar, letting the rich tobacco burn hot before exhaling a thick cloud of gray smoke into the silent room. The smoke drifted lazily across the brass reading lamp, creating a hazy curtain between us. "What company?" I asked, my voice completely flat and devoid of any paternal warmth. Bradley blinked, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. "The construction supply company," he said slowly, as if speaking to a child. "Our company, Dad. The one I run." I leaned back in my leather armchair and tapped the ash from my cigar into the heavy crystal ashtray on my desk. "I do not own a civil construction supply company anymore, son," I stated factually. Bradley completely froze. "I sold my entire 51% majority stake to Richard Blackwood exactly 2 hours ago. The cash is already sitting in an offshore account. Richard is the new majority owner." The color completely vanished from Bradley's face. Richard Blackwood was our biggest, most hated corporate rival. The idea that his mortal enemy now owned the company he had planned to steal was completely incomprehensible to him. "You sold it to Richard," he whispered, the sheer horror of the revelation ripping the breath from his lungs. "That is completely impossible. I am the regional director. You cannot do that without my executive signature." Mitchell Reed stepped forward from the shadows, a dark, victorious smile playing on his lips. "Actually, Bradley, as the majority shareholder, he had every legal right to liquidate his assets," Mitchell explained smoothly. "And as of 4 o'clock this afternoon, the new board of directors convened for an emergency meeting. You were officially terminated from your position for gross misconduct. You are no longer the chief executive officer. You are absolutely nothing." Bradley staggered backward, bumping into his sobbing wife. "But my accounts," he gasped, clutching his chest. "My credit cards. I froze every single credit card issued in your name at exactly 5 o'clock today," I replied coldly. "The joint family bank accounts have been completely drained. Every penny I own has been legally transferred into an irrevocable trust that you can never ever touch. Even if you somehow manage to drug me tonight and force me into a psychiatric ward tomorrow morning, you would be the legal guardian of an old man with 0 assets. That fancy piece of parchment on the dining room table is completely worthless. It is a fake document I had Mitchell draft just to get you into this room. You gave up everything for a piece of bait." Bradley looked at the floor, realizing that his luxurious life was entirely gone. He had no job, no money, and no future. His expensive suit was now just a costume hiding a completely ruined man. "And as for that $8 million you stole from my workers' pension fund," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous freezing register. "The money your greedy wife used to buy expensive luxury cars for her young lover. That is no longer an internal corporate issue. That is a massive federal crime that carries a mandatory prison sentence for both you and your deeply unfaithful wife." I looked past my trembling son and nodded toward the tall man standing near the bookcase. Agent Carter stepped fully into the light, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. The metallic clinking sound echoed like a death knell in the quiet study. "Mr. Caldwell," Agent Carter said with absolute finality, "we would like to have a very long word with you down at the Federal Bureau." The heavy, unforgiving financial guillotine had finally dropped permanently, severing his arrogant head from his stolen corporate crown forever. The metallic sound of Agent Carter's handcuffs hung in the air. The reality of federal prison shattered Stephanie's shock. She let out a piercing scream. It was the primal sound of a cornered animal. She spun around and lunged at her husband. Her hands turned into claws, striking Bradley violently across the face. The sharp crack of her palm hitting his cheek echoed through the room. "You useless loser!" she shrieked, spit flying from her lips as she struck him again and again. "You promised me this plan was foolproof. You told me the old man was stupid. You ruined my life, you pathetic excuse for a man." Bradley did not try to defend himself. He just stood there absorbing her blows as if he deserved every single one. Realizing that beating her husband would not save her from federal charges, Stephanie's survival instinct kicked in. She shoved Bradley aside with all her strength and bolted toward the open door. She thought she could outrun the consequences, hoping to reach her vehicle and disappear into the night. But she barely made it 2 steps into the hallway before the sheriff moved. He was a large man with decades of law enforcement experience, and he was not about to let an embezzling socialite escape. He stepped smoothly into her path, grabbing her by the shoulders. She fought him like a wildcat, thrashing and kicking her expensive heels against his shins. The sheriff easily overpowered her struggle, spinning her around and driving her against the solid doorframe. He grabbed her wrists, pulling them securely behind her back. The sharp, ratcheting sound of the heavy steel handcuffs closing tightly around her wrists cut through her hysterical screaming. With his wife detained and screaming profanities at the wall, Bradley finally experienced a total collapse. The last fragile threads of his executive dignity unraveled. His knees buckled beneath him, and he dropped heavily onto the vintage rug. He crawled across the floor toward my leather armchair, his shaking hands reaching out to grab the fabric of my trousers. Tears streamed down his pale face in rivers of profound regret. Snot ran freely from his nose, ruining his wealthy image entirely. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a desperate terror. "Dad." "Please," he sobbed hysterically, his strained voice painfully cracking and breaking into pathetic squeaks. "I am so sorry. I honestly do not know what I was thinking. She forced me to do it, Dad. She demanded the stolen money. I simply wanted to make her happy. Please do not let these men take me away. I am your only son. I am your only boy. You cannot let me go to a federal prison. I will not survive in there." When I did not show a single physical reaction, when my face remained a mask of carved stone, he resorted to the ultimate emotional manipulation. He invoked the most sacred memory I possessed. "Think about Mom," he wailed, burying his wet face against my knee. "Think about what Martha would say right now. She would never want this terrible fate for me. She loved me, Dad. Please, just for my dead mother's sake, tell these officers to stop. Tell them you will drop all the criminal charges. I will give every single stolen penny back. I swear it." Hearing him explicitly speak his mother's name to save his own skin filled my aging heart with a quiet, terrifying darkness. Martha would have been absolutely heartbroken by the cruel monster our once innocent son had sadly become, but she would have absolutely never tolerated his wicked, unforgivable cruelty. I slowly reached down and forcefully grabbed him incredibly firmly by the ruined collar of his expensive suit. I powerfully pulled him straight back aggressively, forcing him to completely let go of my leg and made him look directly into my unwavering eyes. My intense gaze was entirely completely devoid of any residual warmth, any lingering pity, or any biological parental love. He had systematically burned all of those precious emotions completely to the ground over the past few traumatic days. I silently looked down at the pathetic, sobbing, broken creature kneeling weakly on my floor, and I coldly delivered my absolute final verdict. Your mother would be deeply ashamed of the spineless coward you truly are. I stated, my vocal tone dropping heavily into a freezing, emotionless whisper. I slowly glanced over at the jagged, broken pieces of the smashed mahogany box resting on my wooden desk. You shouldn't have given liquor to a sober man's son. I looked back up and gave a single nod toward Agent Carter. The imposing agent stepped forward, roughly grabbing Bradley by the arms and hauling him straight to his feet. Bradley's legs were like melted jelly. He could not even support his own weight. Agent Carter pulled his trembling arms behind his back and secured the heavy steel cuffs. The loud click signaled the absolute end of my son's stolen freedom. The sheriff and the federal agent marched them both straight out of the quiet study. I remained perfectly seated in my chair, taking a slow drag from my cigar as I listened to their chaotic exit. Stephanie was still screaming obscenities, cursing the day she ever met my son. Bradley was sobbing uncontrollably, desperately calling out for me one last time before the heavy front door slammed shut. I slowly walked over to the large front window. The driveway was bathed in the flashing red and blue lights of the waiting police cruisers. I watched silently as the officers forced my son and my daughter-in-law into the back of separate patrol cars. The engines roared to life. The heavy tires crunched loudly against the loose gravel as the vehicles turned around and sped down the long driveway toward the main road. Their muffled, desperate screams echoed briefly into the cold night air, fading away until the ranch was entirely consumed by complete, absolute silence. 8 months have passed since that dark Thursday evening. The justice system moves slowly, but when it finally arrives, it brings a heavy, unyielding hammer. I sat in the back row of the federal courthouse wearing a simple gray suit and watched the final verdict come down. Bradley did not look like a wealthy regional director anymore. The expensive tailored suits were permanently replaced by a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. His perfectly styled hair was rapidly thinning, and his face was hollow, aged deeply by months of terrified anticipation in a cold holding cell. The federal judge showed absolutely zero leniency. The sheer scale of the financial fraud, combined with the sickening conspiracy to forcefully commit and poison his own father, thoroughly disgusted the entire court. Bradley was sentenced to 15 years in a high-security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. When the wooden gavel struck the heavy block, my son did not cry. He just stared blankly at the floor, completely broken, finally understanding the true devastating cost of his blinding arrogance. Stephanie did not fare much better. She had desperately tried to negotiate a lenient plea deal by throwing Bradley